Hello, welcome once again to Reasonable Faith. I am Ethan Brown, and I'm leading you in this discussion of logical and philosophical arguments for faith in God. And today we're going to be looking at Pascal's famous wager. This is going to be a somewhat different argument from all of the arguments that we've seen. And of course, each argument is its own thing, but it's a very different approach. Rather than approaching the question of is there a God based upon the idea that, well, let me see if I can find some evidence to prove that, this argument kind of assumes that some of that has been done. Both arguments for and against God have been considered and ended in something of a stalemate. And the question is, well, what do you do then? If you can't ever flip the needle one way or the other, is there something that might decide the thing? That's going to be what Pascal's wager actually is. So this is not a discussion about here's reasons that I must believe in God. Here's something that kind of proves it, or at least proves that it's more likely than not. Rather, it is more a question of, okay, well, having the ambiguity that exists in a world of the sort in which we find ourselves, what is the best thing to do in response to it? It comes to us from this rather brilliant person that you see on the screen right here. This is Robert Downey Jr., who played Iron Man. No, that's not true. This is Robert Downey Jr., who played Iron Man. But you understand the confusion. I mean, look at that. Now, this is Blaise Pascal, French mathematician, physicist, inventor, theologian, and philosopher. And of those, he's not a thoroughly educated theologian. He is a layman practicing theologian. I'm not sure at the time he would have worn the title. But then I'm not sure he would have worn the title of many of the titles that you see there on the screen next to his rosy face, because he was a child prodigy. Now, honestly, it would be easy to explain Pascal's wager in just a few sentences. Many people do. But I want to take a little bit of time looking at the mind of this brilliant man and going just a tad bit deeper into how he produced this and what it actually is, looking at some of it in the words of the man himself. Because sometimes Pascal's wager is dismissed as a thing that is a manipulative tool. Sometimes it's used as a manipulative tool. And quite honestly, I understand rejecting a shallow understanding of Pascal's wager as an unfair and unrealistic thing. This man that you see here, he is incredibly fair. He's honest about his struggle for himself. In fact, I believe Pascal actually used the wager as a means to decide between a faithful position and an unfaithful one. You need to understand the guy is really a brilliant man, a child prodigy. He died at the age of 39. And in that time, he had established himself as all of those things. In fact, Pascal is mostly known these days probably for his wager and as a mathematician, but he was also an amazing inventor. He invented the very first, at least to my knowledge, mechanical calculator that isn't an abacus. This is a picture of the Pascaline that he invented for his father, who was an accountant and was very laborious with math. And he's like, if only I could come up with a mechanical tool that would help him to do that. Well, this is in the 1600s. This is the very first mechanical calculator, I do believe. He's also the father. He basically invented the discipline of mathematical probability as a field of study. Prior to Pascal, no one was really studying probabilities. But Pascal, as again, a relatively young man at the time, invented this thing. He actually came up with something called Pascal's line, which is it's a really complex thing about the behavior of cones. And he submitted it when he was 16 years old to a professor for analysis. And the professor charged his father and said, "This is actually your father's work. There's no way this is written by a 16-year-old boy." But it was. And the professor, showing his own ignorance, dismissed also his proofs. That later become kind of a standard proof in mathematics. I'm not a mathematician myself, or I'd tell you more about it. I read about it. I don't understand it. So we'll just leave that and move on. But to his study of probability, the reason that he actually began this study of probability is actually a very pragmatic reason. And it has to do with gambling, which is why he will pitch this theological idea in the form of a wager. He begins with wanting to settle. He and a friend wanted to settle a situation where you had a group of people who come together, a couple of gentlemen who come together, and they want to depart from a gambling game before everyone has been eliminated. So gambling, in gambling, you win when you have the pot and you have taken all of the other person's chips. That's actually a completed gambling endeavor. Well, he wants to say, well, what if you want to end early? What if, for instance, you have two gamblers and they both agree they need to end the game and they need to do it early. And at the time of that decision, one of them has 35% of the chips or the money that is in play, and the other one has 65% of the chips that is in play. And the one who has 35% might say, well, since we're quitting early, let's go ahead and split the pot 50-50. After all, I could still come from behind in this game. And if I did that, you'd end up with nothing. So since there's a chance of that, and I am eliminating that chance of that for you, let's split the pot 50-50. And the other person could say, well, I guess maybe I could lose everything. But that doesn't seem very likely. How about you get 10% because I'm a nice guy? And neither of those are really based on any empirical reasoning. It's emotional reasoning that's going on. And so Pascal invents the field of probability to attack that particular problem so that you could actually proportionally measure not just how much each person has, but the chances each person has of surviving continuing gambling in order to win the game. And so the field of probability launches from that auspicious beginning. Pascal's wager that we're considering here is going to rise out of that, wherein Pascal treats this new concept of the questions of mathematics and probability to the question of, is there a God? So Pascal is going to take his newly developed math theorems and he's going to apply those principles to the question of, what should I do about this question? How should I bet against the question, is there a God? Now, I think before we continue, it's worth remembering just very briefly where Pascal is situated and what world he lived in. We live in a very cosmopolitan world where when you use the word God, if you want to designate God as the Christian God, you need to affix the adjective Christian to the word God. Because otherwise, when you say God, a host of opportunities come up. In our cosmopolitan world, you can interact with people of a myriad of faiths. If you were to go to any large metropolitan area in the United States and walk downtown, you might pass people of 10 different faiths in 10 blocks, or even in 2 blocks. That was not so in 1600s Europe, where Pascal actually lived out his life. Remember, he was born in 1623 and died in 1662. So he lives slightly after the launch of the Reformation in a time of religious upheaval, but it's religious upheaval that is entirely Christian. The world of France is a Christian world. And the world in which he lived is very different from ours. In the 1640s, the city of Paris, where Pascal lived, was a walled city. And the walls were not decorative, they were strategic to protect the city in case of war. Now let that sink in for a minute. We are dealing with a vastly different kind of guy than you and I are. So when he talks about is there a God, he's not going to consider Allah or Vashti in the options of God. It is Yahweh and the Christian understanding of Yahweh entirely as he's computing this. So Pascal's wager has to kind of, I think, to some extent, be given the liberty of exploring God only through that context. And I think then when we understand it, we'll understand it better. Pascal's wager comes out of a book called Pensées. Pensée is French for thoughts, and it is Pascal's notes that he wrote with the plan of writing a much larger and more organized and structured work of Christian apologetics. He is writing a defense or an apology, but not apology as in, I'm sorry, I'm a Christian. Apology as in, here's a defense of why I'm a Christian and why you ought to be as well. So that's what he is constructing, and he's writing this in this realm of philosophical doubt, that in his culture is relatively new, but also relatively rampant. There are a lot of people who function at a high degree of skepticism. And so his writing might have been, when he was finished with it, an apologetic for skeptics. Now, the Pensée, as it exists, was never put together into any sort of finished work. And so what we have are his thoughts somewhat scattered. They are not ordered, and editors who have published them have disagreed about what order they ought to be placed in. And it's a collection of fragments, some of which are kind of like essays, most of which are kind of like proverbial statements. And yet, when you read them, when you read your way through them, you can see an organized line of thought that he is laying out to defend the Christian faith and give a reason for believing it. But the apology is going to come in this. And what he is going to do is offer to skeptics the idea that they ultimately have to make a choice about the question of God. So let's go ahead and have a look at Pascal's wager, and as it's presented in the Pensées. As I said, we're going to see some of Pascal's original words here. When you see his words, they'll be in a different font than you see them when they're my words. So let's go ahead and begin the wager itself, beginning with the idea that, well, what if I do not want to bet? I'm not a gambling person. And unless I have reason being compelled by the force of logic to accept an argument, I'm not going to accept it. Well, Pascal would say that's interesting, but it doesn't make the slightest bit of difference. You have to wager about this. No one gets to be indifferent about the matter of God's existence. By virtue of birth, you have a seat at the gambling table. Pascal would say that this way. He says, our soul is cast into a body where it finds number, time, dimension. Thereupon it reasons and calls this nature, necessity, and can believe nothing else. Meaning, you find yourself in a body whether you want to be or not. You didn't ask for your birth, but there it is. And once you live, born into this reality, then you begin reasoning. And like it or not, you encounter nature and things of necessity. So you can't avoid this. This is the state in which your mind finds itself, put into a particular body at a particular time, facing particular realities. So a game is being played at the extremity of this infinite distance where heads or tails will turn up. So either there will be a God or there won't. The extremity of the infinite, meaning it's really beyond what we can see. So way out there, this game is being played, and there is either a God or there is not a God. And one way or another, that's going to turn up. As of right now, the coin is flipping, and we don't know the conclusion. We can't see it. So that's the state in which we find ourselves. So you say, well, I don't want to bet. He says, yes, but you must wager. It is not optional. You are embarked. So that's the first point of the wager. There is no sitting it out. There is no neutral position with respect to, does a person choose to believe in God or not? You're already here in this universe. And this is the big question of the universe. If there's no God, that has huge implications for everything else. If there is a God, that has huge implications for everything else. You have to make a decision about that. So he then points out that reason cannot convict me one way or the other. And doesn't mean that it has no input, but ultimately, Pascal really wrestled with the reality that there are so many uncertainties and so much that is difficult to interpret. This is one of my favorite things from Pascal. He says, "This is what I see and what troubles me. I look on all sides and I see only darkness everywhere. Nature presents to me nothing which is not matter of doubt and concern. If I saw nothing there which revealed a divinity, I would come to a negative conclusion. If I saw everywhere the signs of a creator, I would remain peacefully in faith. But seeing too much to deny and too little to be sure, I am in a state to be pitied. Wherefore, I have 100 times wished that if a God maintains nature, she, being nature, should testify to him unequivocally, and that if the signs she gives are deceptive, she should suppress them altogether, that she should say everything or nothing, that I might see which cause I ought to follow. Whereas, in my present state, ignorant of what I am or of what I ought to do, I know neither my condition nor my duty. My heart inclines wholly to know where is the true good in order to follow it. Nothing would be too dear for me for eternity." So he's saying, I look at the world around me and I see a lot of things that are best explained by the existence of a God. A lot of things that are really convincing. But then I also look around me and I see things that make that very difficult to maintain. And all of the injustice and evil makes it difficult to continue to believe that there is a God. Or the fact that there's a lot that can be explained makes it difficult to believe that there's a God. So he finds himself, too honest to say that by reason alone, he can come to absolute conviction one way or the other. He finds himself instead torn. And he says, what will you wager? According to reason, you can do neither the one thing nor the other. According to reason, you can defend neither of the propositions, the two propositions being God exists and God does not exist. He says by reason, these, by the way, those earlier 3 slides were all from one quote. This is a separate point in the Pensée. But he says, by reason, you really can't prove either one of these. So if reason has to be convinced, you don't know. So you're stuck in a point where his new discipline of probabilities kick in. And you have to say, okay, well, what is the more likely or what is the better outcome? That's where you end up with this. So here you then have to consider the possibilities. Now, with the idea that both the existence of God and my choice are 2 different probabilities, you end up with 4 possible outcomes. They look like this. So on the top row there, you have my response, and on the column going down, you have the question of God's existence or non-existence. So I can either bet that there is a God, or I can bet that there is not a God. And then reality exists, either where there is a God, or reality exists where there is not a God. Those are my options. Now, that means that in 2 circumstances, I can win my wager. I can bet that there is a God, and then the coin can turn out so that, yes, there is a God. The flipping coin can come up heads, and I bet heads. So I bet there's a God, and there is a God. Or it could come up tails, and I bet tails. I bet there is not a God, and there is not a God. So in either of those circumstances, I win my bet. Okay? Then there's also two sets of circumstances wherein I can lose my bet. There is a God, but I bet that there wasn't one and I lose my bet. Or there is not a God, and I bet that there was one and I lose my bet. Those are the four options engaged here in Pascal's wager. So to just quickly define betting on God, that's where I decide to believe that God is real. It is my choice to say, okay, reason has led me this far, but I can't go any further. I'm going to go ahead and choose to believe in the existence of God. And I dedicate my life to understanding my faith and doing what God expects of me in order to be right with Him. So I learn my religious obligations and my moral obligations, and I live a life that carries that out. And I accept the moral restrictions of a religious life. So it's not as if there's no cost here. There would be a cost to this bet in that there are restrictions placed upon my will where my will might want to do something and the divine revelation says that's forbidden. Okay, so that's what betting on God looks like. I accept there's a God, I dedicate my life to figuring Him out, and I live within the strictures of my faith. To define betting against God would be the opposite of that. I decide to believe that there is no God. So I cannot be convinced, and I've decided, okay, well, I can't prove that there's not, but I am not sufficiently convinced that there is, so I'm going to say that there isn't. And in doing that, I reject religious life, and I reject religious restraint. I live my life as I see fit. I become my own moral code. So sometimes I'll live what religious people would call morally, and at other times I would live immorally, but never with any religious input or considerations. I'm just doing what I believe is best, what I choose for myself. So that would be betting against the existence of God. Pascal sets up the wager this way. He says, since you must choose, let us see which interests you least. You have two things to lose, the true and the good. So let's say you bet that there is a God and there isn't. There's no God, but you bet that there was. Well, then you lost the truth. And I suppose you also would lose whatever goods might come from being kind of your own moral master. So the true and the good. Or say there is a God and you bet against him. You say there's not. Then you lose the truth. And whatever goods would come from knowing God. So those are the two things that you could lose. There are two things at stake, your reason and will, and your knowledge and your happiness. So your reason, will, and knowledge, I think he might have actually lumped together those three, although knowledge and happiness, maybe he saw that as a category. I'm not certain. But by reason, your reason might be saying, well, we can't make up our mind. And if you make a bet at all, you're violating my principles. I have to be convinced, reason says, and I'm not convinced. So you're breaking me if you make any bet at all. And then happiness would be the consequences of the bet. So the religious restrictions might make you very unhappy. You know, if you bet that there is a God and you get stuck in some just really unhappy life that if but there weren't a God you would escape from, okay? But you've bet that there is a God, well, then your happiness might be somewhat forfeit there. So those are the things that you have to lose. And your nature has two things to shun, error and misery. So you don't want to be wrong and you don't want to be miserable and unhappy. And those things ride on whether there's a God. If there's no God, then it is an error to live religiously and it might lead to misery. And if there is a God, then he structured the universe such that to reject him is error and to reject him also leads to misery. So that's how he structures the bet. He says, your reason is no more shocked by choosing one than the other, since you must, of necessity, choose. So he says, either way you go, reason is going, whoa, you can't choose that there's no God because that hasn't been proven yet. Or, whoa, you can't choose that there's a God. Either way, your reason is going to be shocked, and it's going to be shocked to the same degree. So he says, okay, let's set that aside. That point is settled. So the remainder of the wager is going to focus on this. He says, but your happiness, how does that figure in? He says, let us weigh the gain and the loss in wagering that God is. Now, he's not going to explore real thoroughly the idea that God is not. He's just going to look at it. Let's explore wagering that God is. Let us estimate these two chances. If you gain all. If you lose nothing. What he means there is that if you bet that there is a God, and there is, then you gain everything because God has promised everything. If you bet that there is a God and there isn't, what have you lost? Well, there's no afterlife, so there's no winning or losing in that case, so you lose nothing. And he says, wager then without hesitation that he is. That's going to be the thrust of his argument. If you gain everything. If you lose nothing. Only the fool doesn't bet for him. He says, but what if the odds, this is me, he says, what if the odds are stacked very, very badly against me? So there's an infinite number of chances that there is or isn't a God. And say, what if there's only one of an infinity? One time. So like Doctor Strange does his 14 million and whatever the number is times when they fight Thanos, and there's only one where they beat him. Well, what if there's only one time in an infinity of chances, one time where there is a God? So my odds are really, really bad. Now he would, I think, point out that there's no way of knowing those odds, but what if that's what they were? Well, he said you still should bet for it. He says, but there is an eternity of life and happiness. And this being so, if there were an infinity of chances, of which one only would be for you, you would still be right in wagering one to win two, and you would act stupidly being obliged to play by refusing to stake one life against three at a game in which an infinity of chances there's only one for you, if there were an infinity of infinite happy life to gain. So what he's saying there is, he does his math probabilities, and he says, well, what if your bet is 1 against 2? So I have one life, I bet it. If I lose at the end of my life, I lose my life. But if I win, I get to have 2 lives. Well, that's a pretty good odds. And if say I get to have 3 odds, even better. And he's saying, well, here the circumstances are an eternity of life and happiness, infinite, an infinity of infinitely happy life. He says, well, you would have to be crazy not to bet for that, when the alternative is not really a loss because you lose nothing. Okay? So here's my circumstances, and here's the chart again with the 4 options. And let's say I bet that there is a God, and there is not a God. Say that's the way that things fall. So the coin is flipping out there. It lands tails, but I bet heads. So I lose my bet. I say there's a God, but there isn't. Well, what happens then? Well, Pascal's idea is that when you die, you enter a state of nothingness. Afterlife and the supernatural tend to be attached to theistic worldviews. Now, you could quibble with that and argue with that, but that's the nature of the wager. And if there is an afterlife without a God, that raises cosmological questions that are way beyond the scope of this class, honestly. So with no God, there's no reason to expect any sort of an afterlife. So I've lost, if I bet there's a God, I've lost my bet. But I don't know that I've lost my bet. Now, did I lose anything? Well, the cost here is that I lived a religious life when I didn't have to. A religious life consists of self-denial. But the reality is a religious life also tends to be more successful when success is defined by standards of life satisfaction. If you define success by how much wealth you could accrue or something like that, a religious life often wagers against itself. It lives in self. It's trying to be selfless, so it doesn't aggressively attack every opportunity that it could in selfish ways. But a religious life also tends to lead to more stability in family life, and it tends to lead to more contentedness in old age. So by many metrics, this religious life is a better life. Okay, that's what Pascal's going to argue anyway. So there is a cost in not letting my will do whatever it wants, but then it's guided in that cost into some real success points. So the cost is pretty minimal if I lose. Now let's say I bet that there's not a God and I win my bet. Well, in that case, once again, nothingness. I won my bet, except that I don't actually know that I won my bet because I am not around. Death is the end of what I think of as I. So I am not here. So I won, but I'm not able to collect any chips having won. Okay, and what gain is there? Well, the gain is that I could do whatever I chose to do without religious constraint, and there would be some pleasures that would have been forbidden if I had lived religiously. But on the other hand, I do miss the success of a religious life, the kind of long-term contentedness that I can only know at the end of life, having lived religiously. So again, it seems to be, in terms of odds, kind of a wash. Now, let's say that there is a God. The coin comes up heads out there at the infinite distance. It comes up heads. My reason couldn't know it was going to, but I made the bet that there wasn't. I bet on tails and it comes up head. Well, here, the result of that is damnation. Eternal life and eternal happiness, infinite life and happiness, those were available to me, but I bet badly and I missed them. And so this loss is beyond measuring or calculating. I originally wrote into this slide, the idea would be something like not losing money, but losing a limb. But really, it's not losing a limb. This cost is best described as, in the religious terms, of eternal death. That's what this would be. It would be an awful outcome to the bet. And then on the other hand, let's say that there is a God, and I bet that there is a God. Well, in that case, the result, if by betting there's a God, I mean that I dedicate myself to my faith perspectives and coming to know what God expects of me, then the end result is salvation. Eternal life and happiness are mine because God is pleased to give them. So that is the wager as it's laid down. But so obviously, you're better off if you win the bet either way. But as that's beyond your reach, you can't prove it. You are obviously also infinitely better off if you win the bet because you bet there was a God, because then there's actually rewards attached, and that's superior. But either way, if there's no God and you bet there's no God, then you have some freedoms. And this life is all you get, so that freedom is to be desired, I suppose. But you can't know, and the win is better if you win by betting there's a God. But if you lose the bet, you are better off losing religiously than non-religiously because of the inherent benefits of religious practice, meaning living a religious life has its own benefits connected to it. Being without restraint feels good, but because we like to have our freedom. But we also make horrible and self-destructive choices that religion tends to guide us away from. So if you lose your bet, you're better off in the religious column. So all the way around, Pascal's going to argue you're better off betting there is a God than there isn't. Now, he raises one last question, and that is, what if I cannot honestly bet? I just can't do this. I can't bet that there's a God because my reasoning isn't convinced. And while I'm uncertain that there isn't a God, that feels more likely to me than that there is. So I'm having a real hard time with you. I see your argument. I could agree with the points of your argument. But when it comes down to it, I don't want to sacrifice reason and my sense of truth and knowledge for a bet. I don't want to do that. So sacrificing my thinking doesn't seem like a fair thing to ask of me. Well, Pascal took that on as well. He says, yes, but I have my hands tied and my mouth closed. I am forced to wager and I am not free. I am not released, and I am so made that I cannot believe. What then would you have me do? So, and I think Pascal actually here is expressing his own frustration as being a man of great intelligence and having weighed all the arguments and come to the conclusion that this is not an answerable question by reason alone. And he says, and you're forcing me to make a decision. So he puts this, I think, in the mouth of an opponent to the wager, but I think it's probably rising out of his own thinking. He's saying, I cannot believe that's how I'm made, that it just, it rubs against everything that I am to just accept this way. He says, well, endeavor then to convince yourself, and get this, not by increase of proofs of God. And I think what he's doing there is he's admitting the proofs of God can bring you so far, but there's always a leap of faith in either direction. To believe that there is a God requires accepting some difficulties and dissonances to jump over into that. Believing that there is not a God requires accepting that some of these things that seem to prove he is, and that so many wise people have demonstrated as proofs, that's not sufficient. Either way, it's kind of a leap of faith. So he says, don't try to just keep adding to that, because that chasm will remain, but by the abatement of your passions. He says that ultimately it is unreasonable to depend and demand that this be done by reason alone, because reason alone can't get there. It is inaccessible by reason. And it's not really your reason. If you could be cool and calculated about it, the bet actually becomes less of a problem. What makes this a problem is your own anxieties and angst and anger and bitterness, and often your bad experiences with religion and religious people that makes this bet so hard. He says, go endeavor to fight against those passions. You would like to attain faith and you do not know the way. You would like to cure yourself of unbelief and you ask the remedy for it. Learn of those who have been bound like you and who now stake all their possessions, meaning they have made the bet. Ultimately, everything is bet on this. These are people who know the way in which you would follow and who are cured of an ill of which you would be cured. Follow the way by which they began, by acting as if they believed, taking the holy water, meaning baptism, having mass said, etc. Even this will naturally make you believe and deaden your acuteness. So what he's saying is, if you want to believe, see, you're like, okay, Pascal, I hear your wisdom and I'd like to make the bet. You just can't do it. He's saying, well, do you think you're the first person who's ever been in a place where they were perplexed by the limits of their own reason and angered by their limits as a creature, that they couldn't access ultimate reality? I mean, we all want to be God and to see ultimate reality, but we don't get to. And so we're maddened by that. And he says, look, people have walked that path before. And the answer is what God has established in the church. Enter in to the holy rituals and accept them. Begin acting as though, okay, I have doubts still, but I'm going to determine to live my life as a disciple. If I had no doubts, how would I live? I'm going to live that way. He says, that's what you do. And he says, through that practice, it will actually become easier. And the response that he postulates that someone might give, he says, but that's what I'm afraid of, meaning it will dumb me down and make me stupid. And he says, and why? What have you to lose? He's saying people have done this and they don't become more stupid. They don't become unreasonable. They live always acknowledging that they are at the edge of what reason can assess, and they have made a decision to accept the existence of God, and that is no fool's decision. That's not dumb. Pascal is a brilliant man, and I accept with him this idea that this is no fool's idea. Pascal's wager is sometimes dismissed as though it were unreasonable. And the people who dismiss it that way tend to do so saying, well, no, reason actually proves there's not a God, and it's only those who accept faith and the blind leap of faith that will enter into this wager. And when you put this wager on me, you're telling me to deny reason. And no, what this wager, when it's put on someone who is struggling like this, what it's saying is admit that your reason has limits. You are not a God. You are not a deity. You're a human being. And of ultimate reality, you have access to reality only through your senses, and then what you can reason about. But your reasoning has limits. And ultimately, these are questions beyond any of that. So then you assess it by probability and say, well, if there is a God and I bet against him, that wouldn't be great. That's the argument. Let's close with a word of prayer. Father in heaven, you have given us many, many reasons to believe. Yet if we are honest, at least some of us struggle to believe. Like the man that your son met in the Gospel of Mark, we cry out to you, I do believe, help my unbelief. But here, Father, we have looked at a reason to take steps towards you, whether we are fully convinced, whether we still have doubts or no. And I pray, Father, that you would bless each person who takes those steps. Help us, Father, to follow Jesus Christ into ultimate reality. Father, we are so thankful you sent him and pray that you might send him again very soon. It's in his name that we pray. Amen.